that. Okay, we are now recording. Again, welcome to our third and final Campus Urban Farm Urban Gardening Workshop. Today's topic is going to be soil and composting. So hopefully we'll be learning a lot about how that process works and how you can use that for the benefit of your home gardens. So for today, if you don't know who I am, my name is Ellie Perry. I'm the Sustainability Manager for the Office of Sustainability, representing the Campus Urban Farm, which you also maintain and provide facility services to. Today we're going to be covering again, soil and composting. In terms of getting your questions answered as we go along, if you would like to type in questions into the chat box, I have my student intern, Chloe, monitoring those questions, and towards the end, we'll take a break and address any questions that have come up, as well as open up the opportunity to answer additional questions. And don't forget, we will have a random opportunity drawing at the end for some sprout pencils, which we'll talk about. So you'll want to stay until the end to hopefully earn one of those. Just a quick thank you to Shell for donating to the Campus Urban Farm in order to support these community workshops, being able to sponsor this work. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. So for this workshop, we're going to be covering the very important topic of soil. It's actually quite an in-depth topic, so I'm not going to necessarily be able to jump into all the nuances of how important soil is for gardening, for farming. So we're just going to cover the basic cliff notes in terms of what you need to know as someone who might be gardening, and things to look out for and tips and tricks about that. Once we kind of go over the basics of how soil works, we're going to be doing diving more into what you can do when you have bad soil. So talking about compost, there's going to be a little activity / demonstration I'll do for that, as well as talking about NPK, the nutrients that you will need to know, which we'll go over, and as well as how to make your own amendments, so you don't have to rely on synthetic fertilizers or synthetic amendments to grow your plants. And then once we finish that up, again, we'll go into Q&A and our opportunity drawing. So hopefully you all are excited for that. So to start off with, if you attended our previous workshop on plant care, when it comes to identifying problems, there's certain things you can control to make sure you have a successful plant. However, when it comes to having good soil, it influences a lot of the different problems you can see in the garden. So for example, when you have bad soil, you might not be able to water your plants appropriately because either the soil is compacted or it has a lot of clay in it. It's doing something to basically prevent the water from infiltrating and draining correctly, which can lead to root rot and problems like that. Additionally, air is obviously an important aspect of being able to grow plants, but it's not just in the atmosphere, but there needs to be air in the soil as well. So your soil structure and how that's composed is actually pretty important for that, because if you don't have enough oxygen in the soil, the plant doesn't do very well. So generally it's support growth and a decline in health when you do that. And for the soil itself, obviously, the quality of the soil, the contaminants in the soil, there could be a whole host of problems that result if you don't have very good soil to start. So there's definitely some issues with that. And in general, without good soil, you can't really have good plants. So if you have really, really bad soil, it's really, really tough to get good productive plants out of it. So some factors to consider in deciding whether you have good soil. First of all, is it structurally sound? So does it really have the right texture to make sure the plants can dig their roots in, that the soil is not super compacted or polluted, so that actually can be healthy. Also, the actual chemical or nutrient composition texture of the soil as well. So we're going to go over that next, but basically what's the balance of sand versus silt versus clay, and how is that going to affect your water and drainage? Also in terms of the nutrients, so once you have the right structure, you need to make sure it has enough nutrients to actually support your plants once they're in there. And if it doesn't, if it's really stripped, it doesn't have enough nutrients, do we need to add those amendments that I was talking about, and or just apply more compost? And there's certain situations where it's it's just you're so concerned about like the quality of the soil, the pollution of the soil. There may even be, you might even reach the point where it's like, hey, maybe not even worth it to try to dig in the ground and amend this. Maybe I just give up and buy back soil from Home Depot or whatever. And that's actually what we've done at the campus urban farm, because the way the campus, historically, the campus is pretty much built on old oil fields. So there's a lot of chemical contamination in the ground. When it comes to growing food for people, there's obviously that concern about the pollution affecting the quality of our crops. So we actually rely exclusively on raised beds that have kind of been raised up and are filled completely with bagged soil, so we don't have to worry about the contamination issues. Some people are really adamant about like, no, I want to grow my soil, or I'm not really that concerned about like chemical pollution or anything like that. Obviously you can plant decorative plants all you want, because if you're not going to be eating the produce that comes off of it, then it's not really a concern, right? So whatever can grow, that's great. If you're growing food for food though, or growing plants for food, obviously you need to take a little more care about that, because you don't want to be eating contaminated produce. So when it comes to making that decision, everybody's a little different, but this is assuming that you've got pretty decent soil to start and you're pretty much trying to make it work. So when it comes to soil, you kind of want to see three things inside of it. So you need oxygen in that soil. You need water or moisture, or sufficient water where it's not too waterlogged, it's not too dry. You also need a variety of life. So microorganisms, healthy organic material, worms, like things that'll keep that soil rich and healthy. So that's what makes for a good soil structure. And also when it comes to the physical aspects of soil, compaction will basically, where you're stepping on it or like something's pressing down on it really hard, will crush everything underneath it, right? So that'll squish out the oxygen. It's going to crush a lot of the life forms in there. So you want to avoid regularly stepping on the exact area where you're going to be planting your plants, right? So when your plants are in the ground, a good recommendation is to not make your growing area too huge. Some people make the mistake of like, oh, let me build like a 10-foot square and plant everything in there and then step all around it trying to take care of my plants. And that'll compact your soil pretty badly. So general rule of thumb is that you don't want it more than 4 feet away from you in terms of planting a plant. If you can't reach that plant within 4 feet, you're probably not going to be able to reach it very easily, which means that you'll have to step on something to get there, which means that your soil is probably going to get compacted when you do that. So generally, that's a good rule of thumb when you're planting your gardens. Also, adding more oxygen back into the soil, a good way to do that is just by aerating it, which means that you're just digging in. So occasionally you'll find those tools at Home Depot, right, with the little hooks or the rakes and stuff, or even just taking a basic shovel and just getting in there and kind of flipping the soil around a little bit before you go and plant your plants. That's all you need. Aerating is just the process of getting that oxygen and that fluffiness back into the soil, so it's not just a hard packed rock that you're trying to stuff your plant into. And you can also add a significant aeration and keep it that way by physically turning it like that, but also by digging in some good compost. And we have a whole section on compost that we'll go over, but compost is just basically a really rich, material to help create some more soil structure, add more nutrients back in. So that's a good way to get oxygen back into your soil as well. And also when you finally have good soil, so you get that good bagged soil from Home Depot, or you finally amended your garden to the way that you like, you don't want that soil just drying up and blowing away, right? So if you have plants out in your garden and you have a bunch of empty area in between, a good practice is to add some sort of mulch cover, or some sort of it could be hay, it could be wood chips, it could be just something that's going to keep that soil weighted down so that the winds don't blow away all your good topsoil and the soil that you work so hard to get. So those are all ways to consider or to maintain that soil structure. And when it comes to the actual composition of the soil itself, there's basically 3 types of textures, if you want to think about it. So the elements are pretty much when you have soil, when it's very broken down, like basically on the larger end of the spectrum. So think about this almost like golf balls or something, right? So sand is almost like it's a large particle. It's almost like a golf ball, versus like when you get, when those particles break down even further, they get finer and finer and finer, which means the space between each particle gets less. less, which means that it retains water a lot better. So sand, if you pour water in it, it just goes straight through, right? There's nothing really blocking the water from percolating down. When you get to something like clay, which is on the very furthest end of the spectrum, clay will hold water almost indefinitely, right? It's so fine that it packs together and there's not really much drainage in there. And silt is kind of a mix between the two, where it's kind of a medium-sized particle. And I'm not going to go super into this. In the image on the right, you can kind of see that there's an example of what, so people get really sophisticated with this, right? There's like a whole soil texture triangle. You can kind of figure out like, oh, based on the percentage of like what element it is versus sand versus clay versus silt. You can have different percentages which combine into different like types of soil. But most plants in general grow best in something called loam. So that's a fairly even mix between mostly sand and mostly silt, and then maybe like a small proportion of clay. And that's kind of the ideal zone. You can see it's in the middle of the triangle. And that's what most gardeners are trying to strive for, is just a nice, happy loam type soil. And once you get that down in terms of the structure, in terms of like making sure there's enough space between the particles, it's nice and fluffy, you also need organic material. So without organic material, there's no nutrients. The NPK that I'm talking about, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, those are the nutrients that the plants need to be successful. So if there's no organic material in there, it makes it very difficult for the plant to thrive. And adding compost can really help with both of those types of issues. So if there's issues with the composition of the soil, there's issues with lack of organic matter, compost is really good for helping address both those situations. To help visualize this a little bit, I have a little bit of a demonstration for you. So I'm going to stop sharing so you can see my screen a little bit better, hopefully, and also try to spotlight for everyone, and hopefully that helps. Just to show you how different soil can be, I have two samples of soil with me from the Campus Urban Farm. So one is an example of the dirt from the campus. So this is like completely unmanaged soil. It was just out in the yard kind of thing. Like it's not, no one's ever really done anything with it. And then the other is an example of the in-ground soil. So this is just next, within the farm gates where we've planted other things before. There's a little bit more amendment and soil that's been added in to try to restore it, so that we could grow some vines and things like that. I want to show you, and hopefully you can see this. So this is an example of the super industrial out by the facilities buildings, like just dry, just a dry soil sample. And what I want you to notice is like, look how much silt there is. So this is almost all silt, very, very small proportion of sand, almost no clay up on the top at all. In terms of organic matter, which is kind of floating up on top and on the bottom here, barely anything, right? It's pretty sterile if you look at what kind of sand or what kind of soil this is. So when it comes to planting plants, it's not exactly the best environment. It's not like, you can look at the texture as well. It's like super dense and like not very, it's sterile looking, basically. Like I wouldn't want to plant plants in this is what I'm saying. However, if you want to look at an example of just right next door where, interns and, different staff have been growing things, you can see how much organic material is floated to the top, right? So that's like just straight, same scoop of soil, but just in a different area that's been taken care of. But you can see how all the organic matter is piled up to the top. There's a nice little layer right on top. Good proportion of clay, a good proportion of silt right here, good proportion of sand. So that's a little closer to the balance we want. And hopefully you can see this, but if you look at the texture, there's so much space, right? So you can actually see little air pockets growing in. That means the soil is pretty good quality because it's been turned, it's been managed, we've added lots of compost and amendment to it. So it's kind of coming back a little bit, right? So same soil, but just before and after compost and amendments, essentially. So it is possible to restore soil quality, and with just applying a little bit more work. So that's an real life example of how soil looks after you've treated it. For the next section, and I actually see that there's a lot of questions. Chloe, should I take a quick break, and do you want to read those to me, and then I can try to address them while we're on the topic? And I see your thumbs up, so.
Yes, Ellie, sorry. I was at a spot where I wasn't able to talk.
No worries.
But yeah, I mean, if you want to stop by and ask some questions, a lot of people were asking questions about, certain materials, like what does slit look like? What is mulch? What counts as organic material?
Okay, I think I've scrolled to the top of the list. So I think the first question was from Jenna saying, what is NPK?
Yes.
Which we're going to have. So yes, I'll just go through from this point. So Chloe, just let me know if I missed anything.
Yeah, I think so far you're like updated.
Okay, cool. So in that case, I'll just go through really quickly while we're on the topic before we move on. First question was NPK. So that's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. It's the three essential nutrients that plants need, but we're going to have a whole section on that in just a few minutes. So we'll cover more. How do you know if you have bad or good soil? Just looking again at the texture, knowing the history of the land, making sure like, hey, this wasn't like an oil field like our campus was. I'm pretty like, people have been living here a long time. It's, good quality soil. So factoring that in. Would buying soil like at Home Depot or another store be better than? Yeah, depending on how polluted your soil is, that's what we had to do at the farm. We had to just go buy soil because we weren't sure of the quality of what we were trying to do. Again, it's more sensitive when you're trying to grow plants for food that you're going to eat. If it's just something decorative like, bushes, flowers, things like that, wouldn't worry about it too much. Next questions, what does aerated mean? Again, that's just the process of getting oxygen back into the soil. What does silt look like? It's that mix. So basically where I showed the jars, that was majority silt. It's just a mix between sand and clay. What is mulch? It's just any kind of ground cover. It's usually like broken up wood chips and things like that. You can usually buy them in stores. What counts as organic material? Again, it's like leaves and, and branches and like grass or like vegetation. It's basically anything that was alive at one point. How does the material at the top stay afloat? That's because it's mostly wood chips, that are from the organic matter that are floating to the top because they're lighter. And for the soil samples, the sand sinks to the bottom, the silt comes in next and clay goes in last, and then the organic material kind of floats on top. So that's kind of what the composition was. What are the things the CSUDH Sustainability Group commonly plants? So at the farm, we're mostly into food production because we're trying to grow food for the campus food pantry. So our go-tos are anything that you would find in a campus food pantry. So things that have a long shelf life are popular, easy to grow. So like, bell peppers, tomatoes, corn, squashes, potatoes, good, like things that'll last a while and aren't too sensitive. So that's kind of what we're up to. And then I think that's it for questions. So again, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat and we'll periodically pause to take a look at that. Just wanted to make sure I addressed all those while we were on the topic of soil. Specifically. So with that, let's get into the next part, right? So I mentioned a lot about composting, which is kind of like your magic solution for fixing a lot of soil problems. So I wanted to talk specifically about what is compost and how that works. So at the farm, we're really big into compost, mostly because we are committed to functioning as a sustainable system because composting is pretty sustainable. It's basically taking the process of, food waste and like other things that you were going to throw away and actually turning them into rich compost that we can apply back onto the plants and start the cycle all over again. And composting allows us to reuse those products, energy and resources and put them back into the system in a natural way. And of course, like the compost itself is really good for our crops. So it's a win-win on our side. So that's why we're big fans of having composting systems on a regular basis. And when it comes to the home garden, there's a lot of benefits to composting for just yourself, both for the garden and for the planet. So when you compost, you're essentially restoring vital nutrients to your soil, as we saw. It helps aid in water retention as well. So it's just a generally good material to have for your plants. When we talk about composting food waste, so food is actually a major source of methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is 23 times more potent than CO2. So when you essentially throw food away, like your leftover vegetable salad or whatever, basically, if it goes to landfill, it turns into methane, which is 23 times worse than CO2. So rather than just let that decompose in a landfill somewhere, why not turn it into compost that we can actually use to support our plants? So there's a lot of benefits to that. And when it comes to basic principles for composting, you need a few things. It's kind of the same way you kind of need oxygen, you need moisture, you need living microorganisms. So the way that you get that with compost, there are two processes to make compost. You can try to do it without relying on oxygen to break things down, or the more common way is using the aerobic process, which is with oxygen. But using oxygen is much, much faster for decomposition. So if you don't have good oxygen, it's going to slow down the process a lot, basically. So in order to keep the microorganisms that help break down all your food waste and all that stuff that turns the material into compost, you really need to periodically stir or aerate it. Again, that act of fluffing it, basically, to try to get some oxygen into the system, will help it move a lot faster. An additional material that you need is moisture. Generally, you can get enough moisture for compost just through the type of organic material you're putting in through the form of greens. So the veggies and the food scraps and things like that have a lot of moisture already, so usually it's not a problem. If it does get unbalanced where it gets too dry or anything like that, you can always add additional moisture just by dumping more water on it, right? And that'll help keep the process going. And in general, living microorganisms are pretty crucial to the process. So any organic materials generally have some sort of living microorganisms, whether that's bacteria or fungi or worms, things like that, to help keep your compost pile happy. So those are all within the materials that you're putting in already. Though you can get fancy with it and actually order an inoculant that has specialty, or microorganisms that claim to speed up the process. So that's also an option too. But that's basically the three elements you kind of need to get started. Now, when it comes to, oops, sorry, my screen is popping up. The most important element for composting, though, is time. So a lot of people, want kind of an immediate, like, hey, I want to put this stuff in and immediately get compost out. But it is a pretty long process, so you need to be patient with it. And even when you've made your compost, the ideal pH levels for compost is between 6 and 8. So if you're not familiar with the scale, it's basically a 1 through 9, I believe. But basically, if it's too acidic, which means that it's too fresh, it can actually harm the microorganisms involved in breaking down the organic materials. So it's basically going to burn your plants if you go too crazy with it. And after the compost process is completed, you want to leave it alone for about 3 weeks. So when you leave it alone, eventually the temperature of all that process going on comes down, the acidity will naturally come down. And then so without waiting that period and you rush too much to try to get fresh compost onto your plants, it's going to be more harmful than helpful to your garden. So that's something to keep in mind. So now that we kind of understand how the elements mix together to try to make it successful, basically you have to feed your compost pile. And there's 2 options or 2 categories of things that you can add to it. So you must have carbon sources and you must have nitrogen sources. Usually they're like, people abbreviate this to kind of like carbon is your browns and nitrogen are your greens, just because the colors kind of correlate, even though there's exceptions to it. For the farm, we're more concerned with pests because we have massive problems with raccoons and mice and like all sorts of animals that are always coming after our stuff, right? So we're a little more paranoid about pests than most people. So we have very, very high carbon to nitrogen, where most of it is dry. So if you look at our compost piles, like 25 to 1, 30 to 1 ratio for trying to get more dry and leaves and like browns essentially into that pile than the greens, which is most of the food waste. Some ratios can go as high as 3 to 1. I even do like 1 to 1 sometimes, but I don't really care in my home garden, right? Because I don't really care about the smell or attracting pests because it's outside. I don't really care about it. So it depends on you. So if you're really paranoid about like, hey, I don't really want to deal with smells, I don't want to attract fruit flies or raccoons or anything, I need to keep it super clean. You want to gear more towards the adding more carbon and very little food waste to get that process going. So when it comes to what makes a brown, what makes a green, or what carbon versus nitrogen, carbon is generally dry stuff. It's leaves, it's branches, it's shredded cardboard, newspaper scraps, straw, corn stalks, like anything that's kind of dry, crunchy, but it's made out of organic material, right? So for the farm, we usually use our yard waste, which is, usually the dried leaves and trimmings that we get. We have a lot of cardboard newspaper lying around. We've got tons of shredder paper from campus shredders that we can use. So that's kind of our source of carbon for farm composting projects. When it comes to greens or the nitrogen sources, fruit and vegetable scraps. So number one contributor, all those little, the apple peels, the banana peels, like all that good stuff, your leftover salad, coffee grounds, the tea bags, the weeds, lawn trimmings, like anything that's wet and juicy that we can like put in there. That's a good source of nitrogen. And then so we get lots of that from the green waste that we get from pruning and weeding, food scraps that we collect from the compost drop-off bin in front of the farm. So we're able to use all that to make our compost projects. And once you have those source materials, there's a lot of different things we can do with it. For the farm, I'm going to walk you through kind of how we do our system just to understand the thought process behind that. But we initially started collecting food waste and started doing composting when the farm first started. Since then, we used to be the only composting location on campus, like no one was composting. But since then, we've added a commercial food scraps hauler service where they actually take it to a biogas facility, and that's able to take more things that we don't want, like, bones and meat and things like that are kind of gross, that they'll compost, but they're pretty attractive to pests, so we don't want them. For us, we're able to just get fresh food scraps from people just dropping by and donating. So we avoid anything, again, with that meat and bones and other animal proteins. And usually you want to avoid this in your home garden or home composting system as well, just because they really create like a rotten smell, and attracts pests and things like that. So it's not something fun you want to have lying around. So we send those kinds of materials that we get off to the biogas facility via that specialty dumpster that we have Republic take away for us. When you're in a home composting setup, you're not going to have the advantage of that super advanced biogas facility like Republic Services has. We're dealing with a home composting setup, right? Your food waste, most of it can be composted. It's generally good to think of your compost pile as being vegan, because cooked foods, oils, meats, and stuff like that, those are hard to break down. And again, they create that extra smell because they're very proteiny, like a lot of animals like that. So we generally try to avoid that at the farm. Also for your home compost, eggshells are actually the exception because they're a nice little source of calcium. They're pretty dry. We avoid it because a lot of people like to dump their entire egg pellet into the compost, which makes it super messy and gross for our interns and things like that. So we tend to avoid that, but you can use that for your own home compost because you can control that a little better. Also, another thing you shouldn't want to compost is animal waste, just because it has the potential to introduce harmful bacteria that you don't want getting onto your crops. So that's kind of the rule of thumb for that. When it comes to the actual systems on our farm, we have a couple of different things going on. So for example, a picture here in the back corner, we just have open air piles. So that's one style of composting where you literally just have a pile up against these pallets. And then you just put all of your stuff in there and again, we keep that pretty high on the carbon to nitrogen just because we don't want a ton of pests and things like that. But when you do that, it does make it slower. So, it took about 2 years of waiting, but eventually it started breaking down regularly. We also have a lot of carbon sources in there, like cardboard, paper, etc. And basically turning it makes the process go faster. So this is a little more manual labor where you actually have to take a shovel and move layers back and forth between the two compartments to try to get that aeration that we were talking about. So we're basically turning it in order to get that compost process going. An alternative to that is more of a commercial solution and to make that aeration process a little easier, where we have rotating compost bins. So these are things you can buy on Amazon. Essentially, you put your compost in there, give that whole bin a spin because it's just on a wheel. And it basically saves space. It's a little more efficient than the piles. And then so you don't have to worry about shoveling anything. You just give that a quick spin and it spins it, turns it over for you, which is pretty convenient. Another type of composting you may hear about is vermicomposting or worm composting. So this basically relies on worms to do the hard work and actually arguably is a little bit cleaner because the worms are, eating everything on a regular basis. So basically the process is similar, except you're actually trying to keep worms alive. So that's a little bit different because you basically have to create a home for them where you put a nice little layer of like comfortable like bedding and things like that for them. And you sprinkle your food scraps on top top, broken up into nice little chunks, and they can kind of crawl up from the soil, grab the food, and break that down for you. Once you get a successful worm colony going, you can eat up to, a couple pounds of kitchen waste every week, which is pretty convenient. And on top of that, this actually has a little spigot at the bottom, which you can see. And that's because it generates this moisture called leachate, which is actually a very super concentrated, nutrient-rich, basically juice that comes out of the bottom of the mix, which is very concentrated and good for plants. So they often call it worm tea. So if you see that on stores, that's basically what it is. It's just super concentrated nutrients for your garden. And when it comes to dealing with unacceptable materials, you can't compost everything, right? So the other avenues for our waste to be able to go if we get contamination and things like that, there's always the landfill. So, anything that's non-recyclable, if someone sticks a bunch of plastic film or soil bags into our compost, we can get rid of it there. Recycling, again, if someone leaves like a yogurt container or something hard plastic, or cardboard that's too big to break down, paper that's too big to break down, metal that can all go in recycling. As I mentioned before, we actually have a commercial compost service now. So if people give us things that we can't really process at the farm, like breads or bones or meat, anything like that, we can put it into that bin. And also no packaging or compostable ware in that commercial compost, as well as they have restrictions on making sure that if you do put it in a bag, it has to be clear so they can see that it's not contaminated before they pop it or remove it at the biogas facility. And also yard waste, if there's anything too big, eucalyptus leaves, which are pretty acidic, like huge branches or something that aren't going to break down in our compost, we actually have a commercial hauling contract for our yard waste, and we can toss in stuff there. So that's kind of how we deal with our waste, and that's kind of the disposal streams that are available to most people. And the biggest thing that people have when it comes to composting is not knowing what to put in it. So I'm going to show you an example right now for our activity of what is actually in my compost pile. To start you off, basically, and it's the same process. So any system that you have, it could just even be open pile. It could just even be a container like this. It's going to not be able to hold very much, but people have used buckets, people have used like big plastic totes, anything with air access in it should work. So if you want to drill holes into the top of something like this and just have a mini compost thing going, that's totally fine too. The container is not super important as long as you have somewhere to hold all these things, that you have the ability to mix things around, and that things can break down. And that's basically the process. So to start any good home composting project, just some sort of dirt layer at the bottom. I just grabbed some soil from my garden, so that's a nice little base layer. And more dirt doesn't hurt too. So having some soil to work with as your base layer is always good. And I'm also going to show you so I have a small bucket in my kitchen that I just throw these things into as I go. This is just an example of the stuff that I pulled out recently. And once you kind of get in the habit of sorting, it gets a little bit easier to think off the top of your head, like, oh, that's a material that will go good for your compost. So right here I have, I'm a coffee drinker. So I've got this nice little coffee filter. I use compostable or craft, like unbleached paper because I actually compost everything pretty regularly. And the filter itself is actually a really good source of carbon. So remember we were talking about like dry materials that go really well in compost. This is a great example because this will break down when it's wet. It's a super dry carbon source. So I can toss this in here, no problem. And the coffee grounds themselves, which you can see here, hopefully, as I'm like sprinkling it down, awesome source of compost. Super nutrient rich. It's just the used coffee grounds that come out of your coffee machine, or your French press or whatever you're using to make your coffee. Great source. And we'll actually get into that amendments as well if you need a hyper concentrated nutrient shot for your garden. Also, I'm sure many of you have this. So for example, like here's some red onion, like the ends and stuff. So I was like chopping this up for a sandwich and I had these little rings that were like a little bit too small to put into my sandwich. So that's a great nitrogen source. So this is an example of vegetable scraps that you can toss in. I'm sure you're familiar with, when you peel your carrots, all those little skins, great source of nitrogen as well. Fruits, so fruit peels, right? So what do you do with the peel after you're done, right? So that's a great source of compost as well. Newspaper also is what I use for the lining. So, if you need to line kind of like an interim container with something so it doesn't get too dirty as you're storing your compost, newspaper is a great source of carbon. So I actually use that as a little newspaper sleeve, put all my compost in there, and dump a whole lot into my compost pile at home. So it actually makes a really great liner as well, because we all get those like paper mailers or leftover newspapers that no one uses, right? Scraps like, oh, this like green onion that was about to go bad, so I saved that. That's going to go in the pile. So stuff like that. So, I even have like a few, additional like the tops of the, the fruit and stuff like that, or little skins that come off of it. All of that's great compost. So that makes a really great source of organic material. So you can see how much stuff I was able to divert into this pile, right? And that's just from that's like 2 days worth of food waste, right? So I'm sure that you all have similar processes at home where you're like, oh, I throw all these things away pretty regularly. So it's a great use of all those little like ends and pieces that you usually have to throw away, right? And just send to the landfill and create greenhouse gas. Now that I have my nice food source, right? So the carbons, the nitrogens, it's pretty nitrogen heavy. So you saw there was a lot of food material, right? So it was like wet stuff. If I don't want this to stink, or, I want to break down faster, I probably would need to add more carbon, right? So a good source of that is, I think I mentioned this before, but like shredder paper. So this is from a shredder at one of the campus offices. So I'm just going to dump some on top, make sure it dries out a little bit so it's not too wet, and it can actually, won't stink too bad. Get an example of a newspaper, so I can always shred this up or make another little holder for it and put some more food scraps in here and dump it in. And all together, that makes a pretty effective compost pile. So that was just basic things from, stuff that I've eaten, not anything special, right? So that, and I'm sure you have lots of materials like that too at home. And basically seal this up. I'll dump it into my home compost pile because I have a really big one. Again, if you have your own container, if you want to keep it small like this, if you have a small apartment or something like that, just occasionally give it a shake like that. Or if you want to get a little shovel or a chopstick or something and just, swirl it around, just make sure this gets lots of, movement. So with my home compost pile, I have to turn it with like a shovel. Again, if you're keeping it small, just quick shake, once a week at least, that'll keep things moving and help you break stuff down. So hopefully that was helpful in terms of feeling a little more comfortable with the composting process of it. So let me share the screen real quick. And then Chloe, do we have a lot of questions in the chat?
Yes, we do have a good amount of questions. I'm not sure exactly where you stopped at. Here, actually, no, I found it. Someone at Guadalupe asked, what are things that CSUDH sustainability group commonly plants at the farm?
Oh, I think I addressed that question. So that.
Oh, you did? Okay, sorry about that. Oh, Jenna asked if throw up makes good composting.
It's kind of a gross question, but yeah, actually it's organic material, right? It was food at one point, it's broken down. And even like gross things like moldy, vegetables or moldy fruit and stuff like that, that all works too. Like actually the process of composting is just the process of rotting on like in a controlled way, right? So if you have like moldy food, like salads and stuff like that, like that's perfect. Like the grosser it is, like the quicker it'll break down. It's already halfway there anyway. So, definitely the old food and stuff like that, that's like more not proteiny, like, so more vegetables and fruits and things like that. That's perfect for a home compost system. Leachate, I think I mentioned this during the presentation, but it's just like the moisture that kind of accumulates at the bottom of the compost pile. For worms, it's especially easy to collect because it's like kind of a tray system. So it kind of all percolates to the bottom. You get this nice liquid at the bottom that you can use for worm tea. For earthworms, some garden stores sell them. Also, if you go on Amazon, there's actually an Uncle Jim's worm farm that we buy from periodically, and they'll actually ship you a bag full of like sleeping worms. And that's pretty easy to set up. And it's like, depending on the size of it, you can get like a $20 bag of earthworms to help you out. And there's also some in the garden and naturally occurring usually as well. So they're around. So there's ways to get that. Okay, I think that was it for questions that came up on that topic. So let's move on to the final or somewhat final component of NPK, which is pretty important when it comes to growing plants. So NPK is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. If you've ever bought a traditional bag of fertilizer, so let's say you were like, hey, my plants are not doing well, I need fertilizer. When on any label of bagged fertilizer, there's going to be three numbers. So it might say something like 088 or 13.5. Or some weird combination of three numbers, right? And you're like, okay, what does that mean? That actually represents the different ratios of nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium within the fertilizer. So if you see something like, oh, I want something with more nitrogen, you look at the first number and look for a higher ratio there. If you're like, no, I want more potassium, then you would look at which has the larger number on the third number. So if you're like, oh, okay, well, I want to, depending on what you're trying to do. And different plants require different ratios for optimal growth. So sometimes you'll see recommendations like, oh, well, if this plant's not doing well, you need to get it more nitrogen, right? So when you look on the bag of fertilizer, you would go, oh, okay, I need something with a high first number to help me balance this out. However, hopefully you won't need to after this workshop, but that's generally how that number system works. And the reason that these three numbers are so important is that they're the three primary nutrients for fertilizers that assist with plant growth and development. So these are three pretty key nutrients that most plants need. And some plants are heavier feeders and rely on one or strip a nutrient faster than the others. So nitrogen is more tied to primarily assist with any leaf growth and coloring. It gives it that nice green color that we associate with plants. Phosphorus is more for the fruit itself, or the fruit or vegetable, and the flowering and that process, as well as root growth. And potassium is just a good overall plant function, nutrient, and helps kind of grow good roots and stems for that purpose. So those are the three. That's what NPK means for that purpose. And where you get into nutrient deficiencies is when you run into problems. So different plants have different nutrient needs, and there's general guidelines for detecting, to tell whether you have a deficiency in your plant. So when you get a plant that's yellowing a lot, particularly older leaves, it means that it might have a nitrogen deficiency. So it's running out of nitrogen. So that's why the green is starting to fade, because it doesn't have enough nutrients in the soil to keep up that level of growth. Phosphorus, it's generally the hardest of the three to detect, but usually it's kind of more stunted plant growth and slowed maturity. It doesn't seem to be growing very fast. Potassium is where you're getting a deficiency will kind of show up as like a brown or burnt looking areas, or curling or curling at the leaf tips. And I'm going to show you some photos of what this potentially could look like, just so you can diagnose it a little bit. So a good example of nitrogen deficiency is here. So this is an example like tomato leaf, right? So it should be pretty green, but if you're seeing like it's really, really yellow, particularly in the older leaves, it might be a sign that it's starting to lose its nitrogen. It's not finding enough nitrogen in the soil, so it's struggling a little bit. For phosphorus, it's kind of this weird, stunted plant growth and slow maturity, especially if it's struggling with fruit production. Like you have this big plant and it keeps growing, but it doesn't really seem to generate any produce off of it. That's kind of a sign that it might be dealing with some issues related to phosphorus. Potassium is the brown and burnt looking area. So you can kind of see where it's like the leaves are curling at the tips, it's brown, it's kind of burnt looking. It might not have enough potassium to maintain its plant health. So, just kind of things to keep an eye out for. However, before you run for that bag of fertilizer that, you find that, oh, someone said to go get this fertilizer because it's short on nitrogen, there's actually some very eco-friendly solutions to basically adding a shot of nutrients without having to resort to a synthetic fertilizer. So really easy nitrogen deficiency solution is use coffee grounds. So as you saw from my demonstration, just the coffee grounds that come out of your maker, you can sprinkle that around your plant, give it a nice little shot of nitrogen, and it's a little more eco-friendly as well because it's nice and biodegradable. It's not a synthetic chemical that's going to burn your plant, and easy enough to procure, right? So I'll usually use this for something that's like a super heavy feeder, like rhubarb plants are really bad about just sucking up all the nutrients in the soil. And especially if you're in a situation where you have a potted plant where it doesn't have a lot of room to go pick up more nutrients, that might be a good place to put something like used coffee grounds. For phosphorus deficiencies, crushed eggshells are pretty nice, and it's also a good good way to, because there's a lot of calcium in it, it brings down the acidity in the soil. So if you have a plant that's suffering from a lot of from acidity, or just phosphorus deficient, crushed eggshells can work. Plus bone meal is usually advertised as like the commercial option, where it's just ground bone meal, a lot of protein in it, and using that to address your phosphorus issues. Potassium deficiency, really easy, just chopped up banana peel used, and you just bury that under the soil, and that's a good way to add potassium back. And if you're not really sure what's going on, your just plant seems kind of unhappy and you think it could use a little bit of a nutrient shot, again, compost is a huge all-around vitamin essentially that you can use to try to regenerate your soil, provide some nutrients back. Aquarium water is actually a really good source of nutrients. So if you have an aquarium or access to one, when you clean the tank, there's a lot of like that grungy algae and like random fish food and like all that stuff. It's actually really good nutrient rich water. So that's also a good thing to put onto your plants to get that nutrient back. And again, as I mentioned, that worm tea from the vermicomposter, super concentrated. That's why they sell it in garden stores and things like that, just because it's a lot of rich like composting like water essentially that you can then pour onto your, or dilute and then spray onto your plants to make them a little happier. When it comes to organic fertilizers, they actually do improve the quality of our soil over time. If you always are going for the synthetic, like manufactured fake like fertilizer, it's almost like taking steroids instead of a vitamin, right? So like it has a real potential to be overly long lasting, where you put into the soil and just stays there forever. Sometimes it's really harsh on the plants. There's a lot of extra chemicals in there that you don't necessarily want to be putting into your soil. So going organic by using kind of these natural amendments and using a lot of compost and stuff in the long run is going to be a little healthier for your soil, healthier for your plants in the long run. And also in general, you always want to be pretty sparing when it comes to fertilizers or amendments and things like that. So unless you have really heavy feeders like that are, going crazy because it's the middle of the fruiting season, they really need a lot of nutrients. You can usually solve most of your plant problems just by making sure you periodically apply compost at the beginning of each growing season to keep that soil healthy. So continually adding more nutrients to the soil as your plants basically strip them out will help maintain that soil balance. So you don't have to go so crazy on the amendments and the fertilizers will go a long way. But again, you have those are good examples of also eco-friendly ways to do those quick nutrient shots if you really are in a pickle and need something fast. So all good things to keep in mind. So I guess with that, we can do, let me catch up on Q&A real quick, and then we'll jump into our opportunity drawing if Chloe, if you want to get ready for that. So which fertilizer brands have NPK? So actually every fertilizer bag that you get has to have NPK listed on it. So anytime you buy a bag of fertilizer, it's going to have the three numbers that I showed. So there will be a number at the beginning, a dash, a second number, dash, and then a third number. The first number will always indicate nitrogen percentage. Second one will always indicate phosphorus percentage, and the third one will always indicate potassium percentage out of the whole bag. Next question, where can you get bone meal and worm tea? Again, any commercial garden store will have that, and Home Depot, all those good places. You can always get it on Amazon. So it's a pretty common gardening amendment to have. So definitely commercially available. And I think that's it for questions for now. If you have additional questions, feel free to start typing that into the chat. In the meantime, we will be raffling off our prize and our final prize for the workshop today, which is actually sprout pencils. So we have these pencils that we will ship you that actually once you're done using them, you can plant the end and there will be some nice seeds of various flowers and vegetables that you can plant for your home garden. So hopefully you enjoy your prize, whoever wins that. So I guess with that, Chloe, do you have a winner for us?
Yes, I do. And the winner is Giovanni Aguila.
Okay, congratulations, Giovanni. And then Chloe, you're going to message them with the information.
Yes, I will. And then also just a reference, this is what they look like. I have just a plain pencil one and a colored pencil one. And it has a little pod there where you could plant your seed.
Yeah, very, very fun, fun little prize. So thank you all for attending these workshops so diligently. So Chloe will be in touch, Giovanni, with the information for redeeming your prize. Basically, we just need your mailing address so we can send that to you. And with that, does anyone have any remaining questions? Feel free to unmute yourself, type it in the chat. Going once, going twice. Okay, so if no one has any questions, I guess we can wrap up a few minutes early. You know, for the final notes in terms of as we close, this recording as well as the other workshops are actually now up, or going to be up on our CSUDH Sustainability YouTube channel, where we also have a lot of other great sustainability videos. So if you ever want to review this information, check out our other topics. They're all up on YouTube, so feel free to search for us. In addition to that, if you would like to stay posted on what we're up to, you're welcome to follow us on Instagram. We actually have two areas that Chloe maintains. So if you want to check out our farm specific updates, feel free to follow us at DH Urban Farm or both. You can also visit our follow us on CSUDH Sustainability as well, where we post a lot of our events and activities, which you're welcome to check out. Again, we also have our website. We have a DH Urban Farm Gmail address. So you're welcome to reach out to us if you have any questions. So I guess with that, we'll conclude this workshop and have a great rest of your semester and hope to see you at one of our events soon. Thanks, everyone.